back to No Free Lunch, Economics for a Fallen World. I'm Dr. Jeff Guernsey, joined by Dr. Jeff Heyman, the author of your textbook. We recently have been talking about supply and demand and movements along those curves. But Dr. Heyman, I sense that we're about to do something else. What happens if demand changes?
Yes.
What causes demand to change, first of all?
Well, you know, we said earlier when we introduced the concept of demand that almost anything other than price, anything that causes the way people decide to consume, and we have several things that could fit that. But remember, movement along the curve would be simply reflecting a change in the price. And we said that that would be movement along the curve because there will be a shift in the supply. That would be something producer behavior would drive. But now we're talking about, as you say, a demand curve shift. In the way I've drawn this, I've shown a decrease in demand. And so it's important to note that a decrease in demand says that at every price level, the quantity demanded would be less when it goes to the direct. So every price is going to have a decrement to the actual amount demanded. So in answer to your question, what could cause it? Well, a lot of things could cause it. The first thing that could cause it would be just simply, you know, hey, you're making more money now, or you're making less money now. In a COVID-19 world, when a lot of people were laid off work and the economy basically shut down, the people had less income.
So change in income.
Change in income would be the first kind of thing that could draw it down. So you might have a shift downward, and that's going to drive prices down. And we tend to see in recessions or depressions, prices fall, demand falls as well, and income falls. So a change in income could be that. Good news for the students that are taking this: when you graduate college, you'll actually get a higher income after you get that job, and your demand curve is going to shift to the right because you'll be able to buy more of everything, a little bit more of everything. So we could have an income change. Prices of related goods could change. We talk in the book about substitutes and complements. Obviously, if the price of a beef goes sky high, you're going to consume more chicken. So that would be kind of an example. Or for this model where I've shown a downward curve, if this was a market for chicken and then the price of beef went way down, people might shift out of chicken and into beef, and that would drive the demand curve for chicken downward. That would be an example. And then there are expectations of future prices, those kinds of things.
What about preferences? Consumer change preferences.
Preference, yeah, that's a good one. Thank you for reminding me. You know, tastes and preferences are always changing. And for some things, they're more stable. Other things are less stable. There tend to be kind of fashion items or fad items that are the latest hot thing. And then there's, you know, hey, I'm going to buy the same kind of brand of peanut butter or potato chips that I've always bought. But those do change. You know, health concerns happen, and sometimes goods and services will get out of favor. The way I've drawn this here, we would see taste and preferences have changed, and this good is less desirable than it used to be to some subset of consumers.
So a shift in the demand curve is going to change equilibrium price and quantity, as you've drawn it here. Now let's say something happens on the producer side.
Yeah.
Now what if
let me make one comment, and I'm going to show another chart there. So what we see with a demand shift is the effects go in the same direction. Notice that both price falls and quantity falls in this. If we saw an increase in demand, you'd move up the supply curve and you'd see price increase and quantity increase. That's not the case with demand. So let's take a look at demand. Let's keep the same demand shift that we just had. And now let's show what would happen if we had a supply curve shift. In this case, it's a decrease in supply. It's a decrease, as you can see, because at any given price, the quantity you're supplied is going to be less than it was before. That's a shift. So it's up and to the left, but it's certainly to the left is the way that you think about a supply curve. So in this particular case, the way I've drawn it, and this is only an artifact of the way I've drawn it, we end up at the same equilibrium price because I basically had the supply decrease, which will result in an increased price, offset exactly the decrease in demand. But we do see both a decrease in demand and a decrease in supply will both lead to lower quantity. In this case, we were already reduced to a smaller quantity, and now we're going to yet reduce it further to yet a lower quantity again. But the decrease in supply leads to a higher price, whereas the decrease in demand leads to a lower price. So those are a little bit different in the way the effect can work. But Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I suppose it's an empirical question, which is shifting more, and whether the price stays where it is or goes up or down.
It is. Which effects dominates? Yeah, that is an empirical question. We don't know which is going to be bigger or not. And when we use those fancy words, it's an empirical question. It just depends on what the data will do. There's nothing here that tells us, which is kind of why I drew it as exactly the same. We could see the supply effect dominating, and if the supply effect dominated, we'd see the price increasing yet again, to a higher level than that P1. P3 would have been somewhere up here. If we would have shifted, it would have intersected maybe right there or something like that.
I suppose we should go back just for a moment. Now, what would cause the supply curve to shift? We didn't talk about that.
So, remembering what drives the supply curve is kind of principally the opportunity cost of the resource inputs they're using. So if the costs of production go up, that's obviously a big thing that would change that. There could be price of related goods that you could produce even. Some firms might be able to produce multiple items, and they might shift production out of one to another if the price changes. Just as an example, we can imagine that for some reason everybody gets on a healthcare kick and nobody wants a juicy, greasy burger. Well, you can be sure that McDonald's and these other places are prepared and ready to make more chicken sandwiches. Now, they may not compete with our Chick-fil-A that we have on our campus, but yet they will substitute in that production. That's an example. You'd see a supply shift of hamburgers go to the left because there's a change in the behavior of a related good in this case in production, what they could otherwise produce. Those expectations, the future weigh in.
Change of technology.
Usually
change wouldn't shift this way, it shifts the other way. I think.
So technology is constantly changing, and that's why we tend to see output grow in most countries. And that would be a shift to the right as we get increased technology. But actually, you can actually have a negative technology shock, is the way economists think of that. And so a negative technology shock, for instance, would be COVID-19. In a sense, we could think it's not really technology, but it's a negative supply shock because people were not prepared, and it made us shut down. Everything we did was less effective for a while. Regulations, that's another way of thinking about a negative shock because it makes a more expensive way to operate. You could think of that as a negative technology shock, if you will. So those would be examples.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks for joining us today as we've talked about changes in supply and demand curves and the resultant equilibrium price and quantity. This has been another episode of No Free Lunch, Economics for a Fallen World.